In order to recover from OCD, you are going to need some level of compassion. Now, compassion really ties in with acceptance. Compassion means that you have that self-pity for yourself, you have that empathy for yourself, and it allows you to come to terms with things that you've done, things that you don't agree with, and it really puts in the foundations of acceptance. Because if you don't have compassion for the current situation that you're in, or for a certain thing that you may have done, or a certain thing that you may be, what's going to happen is, especially on the recovery journey, you are going to have that internal resistance, right? You're going to have that fighting of the nervous system, where you have the judge and executioner on your shoulder, and that is just going to allow fear to thrive, because you're just going to keep on fighting. There's going to be that resistance to whatever is going on. And compassion, and actually developing that sense of self-empathy and self-pity takes time, right? Because there might be a fear or something, or a worst case scenario where you think, well, how could I possibly have compassion for myself there? If I've caused harm, how could I have compassion? If I was attracted to this person, how could I have compassion? If I did this, how could I possibly even go and start thinking about having that element of compassion? Because you think that if you did have that compassion, you think you're condoning it, you think that you're like a bad person, and you think that that's just going to improve the chances of you having that, right? So that's where fear. Now, with compassion, like I said, it doesn't mean being completely thrilled with what's happened. It doesn't mean like you're throwing your hands up at the air at the possibility of that particular scenario being true, aka in harm OCD, POCD, HOCD, whatever it is. But it just helps to cushion the blow, and help bring about that deeper level of acceptance that is needed. Now, with compassion, especially with more of the taboo themes, the initial knee-jerk response of somebody who maybe has committed a crime, or maybe is attracted to something taboo, or whatever, the initial reaction there is that this person is a monster, and therefore if that was me, then I'd also be a monster, I'd also be a bad person, I'd be sick in the head, all of these different things. Understandable why you might think that in the first instance. Growing up in society, we do learn, or we have learned, right from wrong, and we get these belief systems instilled within us from a young age. And absolutely, we need to have those societal laws in place to protect everybody. Absolutely. But you need to think about the rigidity of the belief systems that you're holding towards these certain things, aka by just developing that level of compassion, even just a crumb of it to start off with, because otherwise, like I said, you're going to be in that cycle of fighting yourself and beating yourself up, and chronic guilt and shame, and not actually acknowledging the reality of the situation, right? If I didn't have compassion for myself for having anxiety and OCD, what I'd still be doing is I'd still be fighting any sensation that came up, and I would still be embroiled in the cycle with fear, because I just couldn't come to terms with how anxious I was feeling, right? And with that in mind, I had to come at it from the angle of, well, look, I'm going through something really hard. OCD is a very resilient disorder, and one of the most debilitating in the world. Fighting myself here and not actually acknowledging the fact that I'm going through something hard isn't really getting me anywhere. How could I start having that empathy and self-pity for myself who's going through something very difficult? And that, as you get aligned with that really helps to take off one of those layers, and you really, you help to have compassion. But in the other sense of the word as well, so like the compassion towards something very taboo, you've got to realize that if we was living that worst case scenario, if we did cause harm, if we was attracted to somebody, if I was responsible, like, you got to think there tends to be a reason for that, right? There tends to be a reason why, it's not condoning it, by the way, but there can be lots of different factors at any point in time that can influence behavior of a person. Maybe somebody who's caused harm, maybe they've got a genetic predisposition towards harm, who, with their background influence from their mother and father, they were taught violence, and maybe something else went wrong, and there was something in their life where they couldn't manage their anger, and they was more predisposed to that, and it just lets out in one go in a moment of fit and rage, right? Maybe, somebody who's, so in my sense, HOCD, maybe somebody who's, attracted to the same sex, hasn't had a lot of choice over that. Maybe it's something in the brain which has just been completely out of their control and developed while there was a fetus in the womb, right? And something has led them biologically and scientifically speaking to have that brain in them. So if that was me, how could I apply that to myself? Well, I could more than likely see that, I have little control over the sexual preference there, because otherwise, there wouldn't be any gay Muslims, for example, but there is, right? So it just shows you how there does tend to be reasons for certain things. And looking at those real world use cases of where other people have acted in that way, that also helps to bring about that compassion, because as you see other people who have also ended up in that situation, and you start to understand, certain things and mechanisms and moving parts that go into their actions, that's when you can also think about applying it to yourself. And again, it's not saying that we're letting ourselves off the hook, or we're going to be completely thrilled about it if that worst case scenario did come true, or if we did act badly or immorally, then we'd be in complete self-satisfaction with ourselves. No, of course there's going to be that element of that concern there. But what happens is, with the compassion, is you acknowledge that something might not be the most ideal situation, and there could be ramifications of that. But however, you still try and come at it from that angle of pity and that angle of empathy. And like I said, looking at the different reasons why maybe somebody's acted in that way. If there was an event in the past, let's say I've got chronic real event guilt and shame, and I've got an event in the past that I can't possibly have compassion for. Well, the way in which I could go about that is, well, if that really shouldn't have happened, if that event shouldn't have happened, right, then it would have been impossible for it to have happened, right? It's like almost fighting an alternate reality. It's like saying that it's raining outside when it's sunny, right? There's no good just fighting it. And, if it really shouldn't have happened, like I said, the universe would have come down and stopped that from happening. And it's also seeing it with that angle of empathy, what certain factors may have contributed to that. There's things I've done in my life that I had chronic guilt and shame over. So, for example, with magic thinking OCD, I remember I made up a lie about my granddad going to hospital, right? And I had chronic guilt and shame over that for years, because I thought, if something bad happens to him, that means it's my fault, right? And what the reason, and like I said about, the reason here, like the reason why I did that was because when I was at university at the time, when I said that, I used to get picked on by some of the older boys, as did all of the freshers, because it's like a power thing in university sports clubs, right? And I remember I didn't have the guts to say to them, I just don't fancy coming to the social tonight, which is like when we all used to meet up and have a drink. I just, I said, look, I just made up a lie about my granddad being in hospital to think of a valid excuse to go out of it, right? And, that was my sort of reason at the time for why I did that, right? And, I didn't have any compassion there, because I just didn't. At the time, there were lots of things that led up to that. So yeah, my insecurity, my fear of being picked on. I also had really bad HOCD at the time, so I found it really uncomfortable to be around other men. So you could see the different moving parts that actually led me to acting in that way. But yet, I was still fighting myself and beating myself up till the cows came home, because I thought, it's just unacceptable. How could I possibly say that? Whereas in reality, I look back now, there were lots of different moving parts that led me to act in that way, right? So you've got to think, like, when somebody does this, or somebody does something, or worst case scenario, maybe acts out in a fit of rage or anger or jealousy or attraction, like they in many cases, they haven't just decided to be that way, right? There can be lots of different moving parts, and that is why we have to come at it from that angle of acceptance and looking at it like that, because otherwise we're not going to let ourselves off the hook. We're just going to be bathing in this chronic guilt and shame that is just going to serve no purpose for us for the rest of our lives, make us more likely to reoffend, and overlook the fallibilities of being a complex human with so many different things that are going on in the brain at a different time, right? So yeah, it's very much a process when you develop that compassion, and it's almost like you become your own friend. And I know that sounds a bit cliche, but you very much come on your own side rather than fighting against yourself. And there's more harmony there. There's more peace there. When you do something wrong in your life, or something that's happened, you're not jumping the gun and fighting yourself around that certain thing. You're not trying to battle your mind in order to achieve that peace. There's that element, that deeper level of acceptance and acknowledgement to say, hey, yeah, that this is what's happened. That the acceptance will naturally be there as you develop that compassion, and you think, well, okay, I can accept that. It diffuses quickly, and you think, well, how can I move on, and how could I adjust and adapt to that and learn that as a growing thing. Like, even in recovery, sometimes there are still intrusive thoughts where you could say it's a bit taboo, it's a bit out of the ordinary, but there isn't that element of guilt and shame, because I know that I can have these tendencies. I know that OCD or not, that there can be certain belief systems and influences and certain factors that can influence the way that I am and my thinking and my behaviours. So that doesn't just go like from the recovery journey. It's pretty much there for the rest of your life, just by default of being a human being, right? So it's accepting that is still a reality. It's accepting that across the board, we're not just going to meet this definition of being entirely good, because that's an impossible thing to fulfill. And it's also seeing that we don't have to be compartmentalized as good or bad, right? Why does it have to be the only thing? Why does it only have to be one thing or the other? Why does it have to be black and white? Why can't we have elements of both? If we was bad, if we did have badness, why would that be so bad? Why would that mean that we necessarily have to fight and beat ourselves up at the first hint of that? Why can't we see, okay, why am I thinking like this? Why am I this way? How can I change my perspectives? What's led up to this, right? And that process of iteration is one that we need to have as we go throughout our lives in order to grow, right? So yeah, with compassion, like I said, it's very much working towards acceptance of yourself. It's very hard to recover and actually make any progress without compassion. It's going to feel very alien actually adopting the compassion, because it's almost going to feel like you're condoning and excusing that. But that's just not necessarily the case. Otherwise, everybody with unconditional self-acceptance would, by default, go out and commit crimes. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have acceptance, that's what you want to do. It's just about seeing the world from a more realistic angle, looking at other cases of people that have been through a similar thing, and bringing around that realization by seeing that, people can act in these certain ways. People can act violently. People can act, in negative ways. And it's seeing that, yeah, we're also not exempt from that, as much as we don't want to be, right? It's also trying to have that angle of understanding to see what other factors could be at play there. And that's like the way in which we go around that. And it's not an excuse, right? It's not an excuse. I know lots of people think, oh, you're just making up excuses and you shouldn't be let off the hook. But it's just the reality of being a human being, right? That we do have these tendencies. We do have tendencies we don't like. I've still got tendencies that I'm not thrilled about. I'm not walking around in this utopia where I'm cheering about every part of myself. No, there's still some parts where I think, actually, that's not great. Or there's some things that I've done in the past where I think, actually, that's probably not the best way to have done it or to have gone about it. But again, there isn't that chronic guilt and shame, that fighting, because I can also see that I have limitations, and that there can be certain reasons why I act in certain ways at certain times, right? So you need to think about that. You need to think about, how can I even just start grabbing onto, a crumb of compassion, right? And then that's where you're going to really build that sort of that foundation of acceptance and that more robust level of compassion that's really needed to help offset that guilt and shame, that chronic suffering, as you go through the recovery journey.